Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's Brian. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith or pertaining. Sorry, I've been trying to appease you, Brian.
Well, now
as
that,
I always do.
Now that you're getting more into, your degree, I assume at some point you will just naturally start to say pertain. So,
I'll just naturally come to the dark side.
Or you'll get educated enough to understand that that's what you should say.
Yeah, well, okay, whatever. Let's not split hairs here. All right, well, we're back at the Bible Bistro.
Wait, we're not splitting hairs this episode. What are you talking? I need to throw out my notes.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's probably true. So we are going to be splitting hairs here a little bit, but it's good hair. Sometimes hair needs to be split.
Yeah.
Am I right, Brian?
Let's split those hairs. No. This is. I think this is going to be a good episode. I'm really excited about what we're talking about.
Yeah, so this
today.
is kind of a continuation of what we talked about last week.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us about this, Brian?
Well, last week we talked about a little bit about my paper, kind of the conclusions I came to on 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. And in the midst of that study, one of the books was recommended to me actually by one of our guests, Matthew Bates, that we had a couple of weeks ago, recommended a book by Haley Goranson. Jacob is the name the book goes under. It's Conformed to the Image of His Son, Reconsidering Paul's Theology of Glory in Romans. So it's really all about glory. And I mentioned in that episode, on the first episode of my paper, that the word glory in Paul occurs more in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4 than anywhere else in his writings. And it occurs frequently in his writings. I think if I remember correctly, 76 times we get the word glory. And I'm going to go ahead and give you the Greek word, and we'll mention it once in a while, but the Greek word is doxa. The way I always remembered this is like if you think about a doxology, right? It's that idea of ascribing glory. So doxa is the Greek word for glory, and then doxazo is the Greek is the verb form, which means to glorify. So if we talk about, and that can be used in a couple of different ways. If we talk about glorifying God, right, we're ascribing glory to Him, or we're giving Him the glory that's due Him. But anyway, I read this book, and then I also figured out that she was the author of the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, the second edition, which was edited by Scott McKnight, a newer edition. She did the article on glory and glorify in that one. And so a lot of this is going to be based on her. It's one of the things in my paper that I really had to kind of come to terms with was how was Paul using glory? And I think I mentioned to you then, I think it's what we can see, but not in the traditional sense we think of as glory. So I found her book really interesting and really, really fascinating. And actually, I didn't get a chance to finish it before I had my paper due. And so I've been finishing it now. And so we're going to talk about glory today, really is the topic. And what do we mean by it? I'm going to start with a quote from her book. This is from, again, Haley Goranson Jacob's book. Paul's use of doxa, again, glory, and doxazo, glorify, are not topics at the forefront of current Romans scholarship, but they should be. I thought that was a great quote. If you think about the things that scholars of the books of Paul's letters, the things they're thinking about right now, justification, of course, has been a big deal. What do we mean by justification? The new perspective on Paul, what does Paul mean by works of the law, that kind of thing. These are the things that people are really kind of focused on. Some other things, well, we could talk about those another day, but she says really glory is an important word for Paul. Now, the interesting thing about it, her point in this and the article in their book, and also in the article in Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, is that we use the word glory frequently without giving much thought to its meaning. We see this with some other words in the New Testament, words in Paul, and we had that whole series, in fact, on some words. It does not mean what you think it means, and I think glory would fit into that category. You keep using that word; it does not mean what you think it means. To quote the famous
Inigo Montoya.
Inigo Montoya.
No, it wasn't Inigo Montoya. It was.
Yeah, it was.
Was it?
Was it?
Who said that word? No. It was the.
It was him. No, it was him. The Sicilian kept saying inconceivable, but it was Inigo Montoya.
Oh, that's
says,
right. Okay, this is a Princess Bride. Sorry, we kind of got sidetracked there. Well, Brian, as you're talking about this concept of glory and like I think this is a common thing that we can sometimes read a word and we've just kind of assigned meaning and we don't even think about it. And it reminds me, even one of our early episodes. I mean, I know this keep coming back to this, but John 14, my Father's house. You know, like we see this word, we assume, we just start kind of going, yeah, it just means glory, and we don't ever analyze this word. And so she's kind of taking on this idea that we need to spend some time understanding what this word could mean and what it means for us.
So let me ask you, what do you think we normally think of it's one of these church words, right? You don't typically use glory. We sing songs about it and stuff in the church, but we don't necessarily use the word glory a lot in outside of the church world. We may some in sports or whatever talk about somebody's glory, but when we use that word, what do we usually mean? Would you think?
I would say, it's always like we'll see his glory. We'll see his glory. Maybe like something that's like his. Well, sometimes I think it's we think we're seeing God. Like the glory of God is God, or if it's like, isn't that? It reveals his glory. It's something that in nature that shows who God is, maybe.
Right. And I think it can be used that way in the Bible. We sometimes even think, and it can even mean this, the idea of shining or the idea of brightness. And there does seem to be related to that kind of an idea. But I think sometimes we think of that, we will see him in all of his glory, something along those lines. We'll use it in that way.
Or, I mean, old school songs, I'll see you in glory.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
that's the other way I was going to mention, future. Talking about the future reward of believers is Glory Land. I remember we used to sing a song, Glory Land, right? And
or Beulah Land.
Beulah Land, but there was
I'm teasing.
But this idea of in glory, it's the idea of the future idea of what we will receive, and we will be glorified, all of those kind of things. And I'm even going to show you a couple ways I think I've changed my mind, partly because of reading Jacob's book on a couple of these kind of things. So really what she's concerned with, and you can see this in the title of her book, Conformed to the Image of the Son, is Romans 8:29. And I'll read it here from the NIV. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And that word image is the word icon that we talked about, or icon we talked about a little bit last week, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also, and here's our doxazo work, those he justified, he also glorified. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I've taught this in the past, and you see this in a lot of grammars even in this kind of thing, this is sometimes used as an example of where the past can have a future orientation in Greek, right? Because the assumption, again, is that glorified is something that will happen in the future, not something that's present. But the way Paul uses this, those he predestined, we call this the golden chain sometime, right? Those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. All seems to be talking about something that's happened past, which is a present reality for believers. And I think if Jacob is correct, if Haley Jacob is correct in this, I think that we may need to think about this as something that is a present reality for believers. There are passages in the New Testament, I'll look at one here a little bit later in book of Colossians, that is almost certainly future. But there's also a way in Romans 8 particularly where she's talking about that. I think there's a different way that we can understand that.
So would this be like and I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but like this idea of there's a future. Okay. Future, we call eschatology a future hope. And then there's a realized here and now, realized eschatology.
And that was, if you remember when I talked about my paper, those were the words I used to talk about. Some people understand 2 Corinthians 4:16-18 as referring to a future event, and others understand it as something that we have now. Realized eschatology. Both of them have to do with the way that God has worked in Christ to bring his people into a status, we can say, or whatever, however we want to talk about that. But the realized eschatology is what we have now. But there is a future hope. Obviously, there is, this has not been consummated, but the kingdom has begun. So we've also talked about already not yet eschatology is the way that we can sometimes refer to this. There's a realized aspect to it, but there is also a future aspect to this as well. I mentioned some of this last week, but the Old Testament word for glory is kavod, which literally has to do with weight. And I'm going to, just refer to this quotation that Jacob quotes from a guy named Berquist. It says, "This is the honor, repute, respect, or esteem in which a person is held by reason of the heaviness of their earthly possessions." So if you think about in the Old Testament, and we even talk about this flocks and herds, right? What the person's reputation or their honor or their respect was based upon their physical blessings, that they had a weightiness, a weight of possessions that showed them to be a person of significance. And that's where kavod, kind of the idea of weight, begins. But it goes on from there to also carry this idea of their achievements, perhaps, or even their virtue or their character. Okay, so not just the fact that they own a bunch of stuff, but also the fact that they have a reputation because of the things that they have done. So you might talk about somebody's glory in battle, right? That's the way we sometimes use the word even today, that the things that they did in this situation, they found themselves in a difficult situation, the way they responded to that ascribes a certain amount of respect or worthiness to them, or glory. I was just thinking when we were preparing for this episode, and we do prepare for these episodes, by the way, interestingly enough. I know it's hard to tell, but the thing I was
I feel like that was a dagger at me.
No. It was really directed at me. The interesting thing about this is I can remember, this is a question I would get pretty frequently when I was teaching in the college at Lincoln Christian University, is I would get people asking me, well, what is glory? What does glory mean? And I would usually start with this idea of weight, the Old Testament concept of kavod, and we sometimes use that kind of idiom in English. We talk about a person's, they put their full weight behind this, which didn't mean, they did not their physical girth, right? It was more about their reputation or their the respect that they have, they're putting behind this project. So glory has this kind of an idea as well. Now, in regard to God, in her book, Jacob says that God's honor as a result of his status, power, character is one way to take glory, or the other way we can see it is in his self-manifestation is theophany, is what she says. Now, theophany, you know what that word means?
It's a physical representation, right, like a manifestation of God.
So can you think of an example of a theophany in the Old Testament?
Burning bush.
Burning bush would be a theophany. You can see, and so it's kind of a symbolic, but a real world symbol, I suppose you'd say. I think about Abraham when he had those three men come to him, yep, and he, that was a theophany. It was a manifestation of God's presence. Maybe the smoke and that led the children of Israel would be another example of a theophany. So she says glory can be this kind of thing that you do see, like a shining thing or a bright thing. We can have God's glory that way, but often she says it has to do with his character or his actions, is the way that we often see this. And so she says that his honor or status can be symbolized either by his redemptive work. I found this really interesting, and I'm kind of still thinking through a lot of this. It can be symbolized either by his redemptive work or through a visible theophany. In other words, God can show his glory, according to the Old Testament primarily, we're talking about still here, either through a theophany, through some kind of a visible manifestation of his glory, or he can do it through his redemptive act. So sometimes you find the Old Testament authors, prophets, poets, the Psalms, for example, talking about the glory of God that can be seen in the redemption that he has given to his people. And I'll give you a couple of examples of something here I'm thinking about it in just a minute. But this made me think about, and I mentioned last week that glory, the glory of the Lord, the glory of Jesus, in other words, that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, for example, the glory of Jesus Christ, we understand to be a manifestation of the glory of God. Right, it is God's glory made manifest. That's First John chapter 1, for example, and other places as well. But it made me think about which of those does Jesus fit into? Is he a visible manifestation of God's glory? Which I would say yes. Is it through God's redemptive action? I would say yes. Right, there's a way in which Jesus fits both of those categories. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Jesus has this role in God's redemptive activity, a very central role. Well, the central role in God's redemptive activity. And he is also the visible manifestation of the glory of God. So he kind of fits both of those categories that Goranson Jacob talks about from the Old Testament. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a lot happening there. You know what I mean? Like it,
right.
Well, I think I think it's one of those things that we sometimes, we're talking about splitting hairs, but like that there is something we need to think about,
right,
when we use these words and as we that what is happening in this process. 'Cause I think, you and I have been reading some different things, but it's even like, I mean, this is like even in the early church, they're splitting hairs about how exactly did Jesus become God? You know what I mean? Like there's this, they're working through this process. And so here we are sometimes, we've talked about this before, it's hard for us to recognize the water we swim in and the ideas that we've just absorbed, but kind of going like a book like this, or even your paper, it's just kind of going, okay, how do we understand this? Because, we've kind of fallen back into some of those ideas.
I think the way to think about this may be to stop, and maybe we should have done this at the very beginning of this episode, but to stop and say, if you talk about the glory of the Lord, if somebody asks you, well, what do you mean by that? How would you explain it, right? What would you say is the glory of the Lord? There were a couple of passages that came to mind as I was reading. And these are some of my favorite. One of them is Habakkuk 2:15, and I quote this all the time. But the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And I always love that. It's, of course, a metaphor, right? As the waters cover the sea is kind of an image. If you think about, how do the waters cover the sea? Well, completely, right? They are, everywhere where you look in the sea, it is the waters. And waters, well, I probably mentioned this before, but in Hebrew, it's always plural. That's why you have the waters cover the sea. Whereas we tend to use it as a collective noun, but that's neither here nor there. But the earth, never mind. It's just me going on about linguistics there for a moment. No, don't worry about that.
Yeah.
But the comparison then, so if you think about, imagine yourself at the beach. Oh, that's a nice thought. Imagine yourself at the beach and you're out looking at the ocean, and the way that the waters cover the sea then is the way that, and here I'm going to say it again, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. So again, glory of the Lord, we're talking about here his some kind of way that we see in creation, in his actions in creation, his glory. But it does seem to have a future idea here, which I think may be pointing toward Jesus, that there's a way in which the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. In other words, Jesus coming to really show us the glory of the Lord in its fullest extent, at least the fullest way that we can understand. And so it's going to be like the waters, covering the ocean. So the whole world will be filled with that. I just love that concept. Here's another one. This is from Isaiah chapter 6, and I thought of this as well. Of course, this is the throne room scene of when Isaiah has this vision of the Lord high and lifted up, and it talks about the seraphim that were surrounding him. It says, and one called to another and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." Then that's the word Yahweh, is Yahweh of hosts. And the whole earth is full of his glory. So, the whole earth is full of the glory of the Lord. There's something about, and we're going to talk about this when we get to Romans as well, another passage in Romans I refer to a lot, but there's something about the way that we can look at God's act in creation and see something about his glory. Now, the other thing that Jacob mentions in her book is that an object or a place can have glory as well. And I wondered about these as well that are symbolized by its beauty. So we talk about, just to give you kind of maybe an example, we can talk about the glory of a glorious sunset. What a glorious sunset that was today. It was beautiful. The way that it looked, gave it a certain amount of glory. Or I think about the glory of the temple. And that's where we see it a lot. And I even, here's one. This will bring it together a little bit. The story of Ichabod? Not Ichabod
yes.
Crane, the first Ichabod. Okay. Do you remember what happened there? Do you remember what was going on? Eli was the high priest.
Vaguely. And
Eli
so you're now Ichabod. It's a curse.
Okay.
Tell me.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you. Eli was the high priest, and his sons were Hophni and Phineas, and they were not good guys.
They took the. I remember they took out the Ark of the Covenant to
go into battle.
No.
To go into battle.
They go into battle, and that's when the Ark of the Covenant got taken.
Ark of the Covenant got taken, and when they come back, and I can't remember if it's Phineas's wife. I want to say Phineas's wife is very pregnant, getting ready to have a child. And Hophni and Phineas are both killed in battle, and the Ark of the Covenant is taken by the Philistines. And Eli is leaning back in his chair against the wall, which, this is a good thing to teach your children not to lean back in their chairs. There's
especially when you're old and blind.
And so when the messenger comes and tells him about what has happened, he falls back against the wall, breaks his neck, and dies. So Eli dies, both of his sons die. Whichever one of their wives goes into labor, I should have looked this up. See, this is the preparation I don't do. She goes into labor, and she says that he is to be named kavod, Ichabod, right? So you see the kavod there, the idea of glory, and is the idea of there is no. So the glory has departed is the way that we usually translate that. So the glory of the temple, if you think about Solomon's temple, it was its beauty that gave it that glory, right? That gave it that sense. So object or a place can have glory. But then, there's this idea of, again, God's redemptive action and the things that he does. And so here's what Jacob calls it. She calls it functional glory. So his glory is in the things that he does. And I found this really interesting. She quotes really a scholar I like a lot, Richard Bauckham, in a book that he wrote. It's actually an essay he wrote called God Crucified, but it's in a book that's called that as well. And she makes the point that in the Second Temple period, the Jewish people identified, and I want us to talk about this a little bit. So think about this. They identified God by who he is rather than what he is. And what I mean by that is who he is. Again, think about his actions, the things that he does, his character, his attributes in that sense. What he is what we really begin to talk about later. You're talking about the theological controversies of the early church. They were talking about God's substance. And so they used concepts like omnipotence and immutability and all these kind of things. But the Second Temple Jews were really focused upon his character, God's character, and God's actions. What has he done? And his glory is seen not because of his, I don't want to say it, not because of what he's made of. It's not like some kind of divine substance, right? But instead it's focused upon his divine actions. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Thoughts on that or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, again, this is the context we always talk about, like that context, but to think about that when they think of glory in the context and that, it's about looking backwards.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's looking back how God has revealed himself and what he's done. It's not it's not about I don't want to say this theological construct that they've put around him and say like, well, his glory is because he is, you know, he doesn't change, which is true, but their faithfulness rested on how he's been faithful.
Yeah.
So I think that's a distinction.
Yeah,
we're not denying that. But the reason their faithfulness was rested, and his glory and his faithfulness rested upon how they'd experienced and what he has done.
And I'm going to go ahead and say more in a narrative sense, in a way. But you know, how's he shown himself, and even Jesus, you know, he comes and he becomes the glory in what he does and what we see of him. Now, of course, what we're really interested in here, both in and I know I'm going to get to 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. I'm going to get back there in a minute, but also in the Romans 8 passage, we're thinking about how are we transformed into the image of Jesus? What does that mean for humans here? And so one of the questions is, what does it mean for a human believer to be glorified? So I said there's two senses in which we use that word doxazo, or glorify. We ascribe God glory, and so we can talk about glorify his name, the way we sing songs and that kind of thing. But glorification, the way we see it in Romans 8:30, right? This idea that we are transformed into glory, or, and I'll go ahead and give you this preview, we'll come back to it in a minute, 2 Corinthians 3:18, where it talks about we are transformed into ever increasing glory, or glory upon glory kind of thing. Then you know, what does it mean for a human to be glorified? Again, many people think about it in the future, glorified body in heaven forever, but there seems to be a way in which this is realized. 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, also in Romans chapter 8, this seems to be a present reality. In what way are humans, or to what degree, I'm not saying the glorification is complete, but what does that glory look like for humans? Now, the glorification of humanity can be future in Paul. Go ahead and do Colossians 3 and 4 for me, if you want to read that for me.
Colossians 3 and
4. Yeah.
All right, here we go. Let's just say, okay. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory.
So that seems to be, in glory, seems to be a future idea. Now, there is a present idea. You died and your life is now hidden with God. Of course, if you go back to Colossians chapter 2, you and I have been talking about this a lot lately, that dying is connected to our baptisms, right? There's a way in which we are connected to the death of Jesus in those. So you've died to yourself, and your life is now hidden with Christ and God. But when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. That seems to be a future-oriented glory. There is a way in which glory is completed or consummated, we could say, at Christ's return. Excuse me. But what Jacob shows, interestingly enough, is especially in the Old Testament, for humans, glory and glorification for humans, not talking about God's glory now. Excuse me, I got choked. We're not talking about God's glory, but we're talking about the glory of humanity in the Old Testament is almost exclusively to do with ruling and authority. The glory. So, for example, it's often used of kings. Right, their glory is seen in their position as having dominion or rule or authority in a particular place. So a king's glory can be seen in that. And again, I'm going to use this word that Jacob uses, functional glory. It's not glory innately because of who they are, but it is because of their function in ruling. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you this so you can be thinking about it. But essentially, she says that's the way that we are glorified now. And I'm going to tell you kind of the story, the narrative that she says is one that we kind of lost sight of in the Old Testament into the New Testament. Now, I have a passage. Look up Daniel chapter 7. This is a famous passage, obviously. This is where you have the Ancient of Days enthroned. But I want you to notice Daniel 7, 9 through 14. Can you read that for us? Do you mind doing that?
As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened.
Okay, let me stop for just a moment. Obviously, we've talked about this before. It's used a lot in the book of Revelation, but we talked about theophany, but this is a vision, and all of these descriptions are ways to think about the glory of God, the Ancient of Days. But even this idea of him seated on a throne and in court, it is kind of a human image, right? It's like a king with his court. And so we see his glory described in that way. Okay, go ahead and finish it up now.
Yeah, and what am I reading to? 11 through, what do you want to
14.
read to finish? Yeah. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing
And
fire.
I'll say this is the enemy nations is what we're talking about here. We'll talk about that another day, but go ahead.
The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed.
So I want you to notice those words that surround this. So he's given authority and honor and sovereign power, right? So he's a ruler, and glory is one of the things that is ascribed to him as a result of that. This is the Son of Man, which is a human image. We understand this to be the Messiah, is the way I would see this, and we can say more about that in a bit. But he then has dominion, which is a way to describe rule, right? He has dominion, and he has a kingdom that is an everlasting kingdom. That's the way we find him described in this whole passage. But the glory there, I think, has to do with his authority, his ability to rule over creation. Now, I'm going to go to Psalm 8, and one of the insights that Haley Jacob gives in her book is that Psalm 8 kind of lays behind Paul's understanding of glory. It's the narrative text. Of course, we know that Paul uses Old Testament echoes a lot, and you're going to see some of this language from Psalm 8. This is a psalm that David wrote, but I'm going to read all of it, even though not all of it is necessarily that important. But it begins with a very famous, Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. I'm going to stop for just a moment. We've talked about this before. But there are two words for Lord here that are two different words in Hebrew. So I'm going to read this according to the Hebrew. So the one word is Yahweh, which is the divine name. That's the I am. That's the name that when Moses in Exodus chapter 3 said to God, who shall I say? What God shall I say has sent me? He says, you tell him Yahweh sent you. So this is that divine name. And then the other word is a word for... it's the word Adon, or in this case, it's our Lord. But it has to do with the idea of, even an earthly ruler could be called Lord. It's Lord in that sense of having authority. So let me read it that way. Yahweh our Adon, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And here we get into glory. You have set your glory in the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is humanity, or this could be man, and I'll come back to this. This is singular here. What is man that you are mindful of him, and then the Son of Man that you care for him. And this has been because we like to use gender-inclusive language, which I have no problem with gender-inclusive language, but I think this may have masked some of the messianic messages coming through here. What is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. So this idea of being crowned with glory and honor. You see, it's a kingly ruling kind of image that we have here. You made him ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, all flocks and herds and all the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, all that swim the path of the seas. Let me go back. Well, it says, Yahweh, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. But let me go back to this. You have made him a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands. What do you think that refers to? What story would that be a reference to?
Genesis.
Okay. And what specifically in Genesis do you think? What specifically?
Well, that Adam had dominion over the animals and the land, and it was the expanding.
Okay, so he placed Adam in this position of authority over creation. Okay, so God created and then put Adam, representing humanity here, right? But Adam and Eve, put them in charge. They were rulers over his creation. And of course, what happened in Genesis chapter 3 is they abdicated that authority, right? They denied that authority, and therefore their glory, right? If we think about glorious, they're ruling. They were ruling over creation, and that glory is taken away. So then what we can understand when we're talking about humanity being glorified in Christ is them being again placed into that rightful role of, once again, ruling in creation, because of what Christ has done, right? Not because of us, but when we are in him and we participate in him, when we have unity with him, and we could talk about how that happens, when we participate in his life and in his death and in his life, in his resurrection, then we are again given this glory. And so Haley Jacob sees this as the underlying narrative. It's glory that was given because functional glory, again, think about that word, functional glory that was given because of the role that we were given in creation. God appointed his glory, right? But not because of who we were, but because of the role, the function that we were called to have in ruling over creation. We abdicated that, and therefore we became less than glorious. I want to quote this one author that she quotes that I thought was so good. His name's Ortland, and he says, we stopped resembling the Creator because we were created, again, icon, think about that. We were created in his image. We stopped resembling the Creator and started resembling creation. We became subhuman. So humans were intended to have this role of ruling in creation. We abdicated that, and therefore we became less than we were intended to be. So that's the story that Haley Jacob sees underlying Paul's use, particularly in Romans, of the word for glory. Now, there are two passages that immediately came to mind. One was, you could probably quote it, Romans 3:23.
Do you want me?
Yeah, quote
Do
it.
you want me to?
Yes.
Gosh, I hate it when you do this. For all of sin
all
and fall short of the
sinned.
glory, and fall short of the
Glory of God. There you go. Isn't that an interesting way to think about that? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So the story that lays behind even that statement, what does it mean to fall short of the glory of God? Again, that's a passage most of us can quote. But what does that mean? Here's the other one, and this is in Romans chapter 1, which I've thought about a lot, and so again, think about this against the background of the story of glory given, created in the image of God, given glory in the sense of ruling over creation, and then that glory gone because of the abdication of that role. So here's Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and foolish. And their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. And that's the word icon there, right? That's the interesting thing. The word idol is that same word, image, right? Images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. So that's kind of the story of instead of worshiping the immortal God, instead we exchange that image for the image of created things and put ourselves in subject, if you will, to this. Now, and I'm still thinking through a lot of this, okay, so forgive me, but even we're going to talk a little bit later, one of the parts of the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is where it talks about the God of this age. So, and Paul talks about the rulers and the authorities, right, of this age. We were supposed to be in that role, humans. We became less than that because we chose to abdicate that role. And in Christ now, we are being glorified. We're being given again that function of ruling within the kingdom, is the way that I'm kind of understanding this story. Let me give you one more quote. This is from Psalm 106, 19 through 20. They made a calf at Horeb and worshipped a cast image. Now, that's another story from the Old Testament. That's the story when Moses was up on, I was close, only several thousand years, 1,000 years different, when 1,500 years, when depending on how you date it, when Moses was on Mount Sinai.
Stop qualifying your statement. Just talk.
I did it again. When Moses was on Mount Sinai, and they said, well, where is this guy? He's gone away. They made this image of a calf, right? A golden calf. It said, here are your gods, O Israel, who led you out of Egypt. And so it says this is Psalm 106, looking back at that. They made a calf at Horeb, worshipped a cast image. They exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. So you see that idea of exchanging the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. So again, that's kind of the idea that Haley Jacobs says lays behind Paul's use of glory in the book of Romans. Now, she goes to a passage in Romans chapter 8 that has actually meant quite a bit to me. Romans chapter 8, 18 through 21. And I've understood this, I think, correctly, but she's helped me understand another part of it that I've not understood well before. This is Romans 8, 18. And I think you'll see how this connects a little bit with 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. Now, I'm gonna qualify and say, as near as I understand her book, Haley Jacob thinks that 2 Corinthians 3 and 4 don't fit this pattern, but I'm going to argue that they do, and I think there's a couple of reasons we can see this. I've already mentioned one of them in 2 Corinthians 4:4, but anyway, Romans 8:18. I'm going to read this, and let me go to 19 first. I think I've talked about this one before on this podcast. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And I've always said, again, there's one of those passages we've read through quickly, and I've asked the question, who are the children of God? And the answer is, we are the children of God, right? We are brought into his family. But again, now think about this through this. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Now, he's talking about future, obviously, this glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. Now, I'm going to say, after we talk about this, that's a passage that's worth going back and thinking through in this framework. So the whole point of this is the point she makes is that seems like kind of a out of place statement, right? Why are we suddenly talking about the creation being subject to decay? But again, she's saying we've got Psalm 8 and we've got the creation account kind of as the background for understanding. That's the narrative for Paul. That's the narrative underlaying of this. And so our transformation by Christ if you go back to the beginning of chapter 8, that we have been justified by Christ, there's therefore now no condemnation. The Spirit of God now is working within us, and we have the mind of the Spirit, not the mind led by the flesh, all of that kind of language. And now we come down to this where, let's go back to 17. If we are children, then we are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. So you think about Christ as ruler of creation, and we are now co-heirs with him, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we might share in his glory. And so that goes to what I was saying last week, I think, with Paul talking about sharing in the sufferings of Christ is one of the ways that we participate. I use Gorman's cruciformity, that we participate in his cross, and therefore we also participate in his glory. So what she would say is happening here is that creation, this is the part that I'd never really had a good answer for. Let me go ahead and say that creation was subject to frustration, not by its choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. And I've spent a lot of time studying this passage. There are several different possibilities that have been offered of who is the one who subjected it. And I'll just go through it briefly. Some people say it's God. Basically because, they, the ones who say that are typically the ones who say that God is directly responsible for everything. So I'll let you figure out who that is. There are others who have said that it was humans, right? And Adam and Eve. And I've always kind of not taken that. The third one is that the one who subjected it to frustration is the devil, right? The evil one. And so that's the way I've always kind of understood it. But now in this narrative framework, if you think about it, the creation was subject to frustration because of humanity. If we read this against the background of Psalm 8, if that's what Paul has in mind when he's writing this, it's saying that we have, because we chose to abdicate our proper role, the creation itself was no longer being ruled in the way that it was supposed to be, but it was instead handed over. Now, she doesn't say this so much, but this is me thinking through this, was then subject to the God of this age, right? The rulers of this age who are now the one. And so the way that Paul describes it here, the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the one who subjected it. And then in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. So it's been put in this bondage. It has this decaying aspect because humanity did not take its proper role. From the time of Adam and Eve, we did not take our proper role in caring for creation and ruling over creation. And I want to be careful to say that ruling over there is the language that's used, but really it's about caring for it in an appropriate way in a God-given, given God's plans for his creation, that he gave us this good creation. So that's how we now, that's how I think about this now, that this is Psalm 8 is kind of the background for this, the story of the creation and fall, that humanity's glory functionally was because we were to be rulers. We chose instead to subject ourselves honestly to the rule of others, right? To the lie. And that's where I think, if I understand Haley Jacobs, she would say 2 Corinthians 3 and 4 isn't this way, but I think that there are some hints that it may be understood against Psalm 8 as well. Okay, that was a lot. Any comments or questions on any of that?
No, there's a lot kind of building on top of here, and I think this is Romans has historically been for a lot of people difficult. Paul's language is dense in here.
Yeah.
He's when we had Jason Staples on, we see that there's Paul's pulling from a lot of sources here,
right.
And there's this kind of we kind of got to weed through this, and so there's a lot there, but that. It does, and the background of Psalm 8, that seems to make a lot of sense as we start thinking about that. What happened in sin was also our abdication, humans' abdication of the role that we were assigned.
Yeah. So we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We've failed to live up to our glory, I would say. Yeah. Let's go back to Genesis.
Yeah. So
Genesis.
so let's go back to
2 Corinthians 3 is where I want to go. What were you going to say?
Okay. No, I was going to say, let's go back and wrap up some. I was going to say go back to Romans, because if we were wrapping it up, but
let's go to 2 Corinthians 3. I want to just look at a couple of things here. First one's 3:18. So we looked at this a little bit last week. Mm-hmm. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his icon. So again, we are created as in the image of God. Our image, we sometimes talk about the image being marred, or we have thrown those images out for another image, subhuman, to use Ortland's language. So all we who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, and again, that's the whole story of Deuteronomy. No, it's not Deuteronomy. Exodus chapter 34, where you have Moses on the mountain. He comes down, he has to veil his face. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, is the idea. So we have glory. It's not yet fully what it's meant to be, but we begin to have this. So what is it? What is that? That's the question that Haley Jacobs asking. And I'm saying I think that this is that functional glory where we are increasingly being given a role in God's kingdom, right? To again take our rightful role. And I want to be careful here. I know ruling, especially these days, can have bad connotations, but I don't think that's the idea. I think it's taking our proper role and caring for God's creation. So we're being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Go down, then immediately following this is chapter 4:1. Therefore, which again connects it with what comes before, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. Now, I want to stop right there. This, to me, is what connects this to the story of the fall. So Paul is saying, and I think it'll become even quicker here in just a minute, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We're no longer going to be led by this lie. On the contrary, we do not use deception. I think about Jesus' statement about the father of lies, who's been a liar from the beginning in John chapter 8, for example. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. That's what happened in the fall, is that the serpent took the word of God and distorted it, right? You will not surely die. Instead, you will be like God, knowing good and evil, right? And so I wonder if this is not what Paul has as the background for this. Again, I'm just my thought. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly. So here's again that idea of truth versus lie. We commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. So again, if they don't understand it, it's because they can't see. Now, verse 4, here's the reason: the God of this age has blinded the mind of unbelievers, so they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image, the icon of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of the darkness," made his light shine in our hearts. So light shine out of darkness is creation account too. So I think creation and fall mediated through Psalm 8 is what Paul's understanding here. Now, there's the reason she sees the connection. I'm talking about Haley Jacob here. The reason she sees the connection is the idea of the transformation into glory. That's what we have in 2 Corinthians 3:18. We also have it in the passage she's interested in, Romans 8:29b. There's one phrase that she's wanting to understand, conformed to the image of the Son. But you see the image, you see the light shining in the darkness, this idea of the glory. I think, again, this is talking about that functional glory. Let me go down to the very end here, and then I'll see if you got anything else. This is verses 16 through 18. Again, what I wrote my paper on. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light, momentary troubles, tribulation, literally, thlipsis, are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So there's the glory language. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So I think, again, what Paul is talking about here, what he's calling us to, is really this renewal of our role to become again the people that God created us to be in the beginning, and to fill the role that he gave us from the beginning. It's interesting. It's not the nation. Why do the nations rage? It's not the nations that are ruling anymore. It is God's kingdom that has come, and it's God's kingdom that needs to be the one that is expanding and the one that will be eternal. And we, as a part of that, are glorified, not in some kind of ontological transformation of ourselves, right? But because we are being called to step again into that role of I would say it's ruling in God's kingdom in a godly way, promoting the kingdom of King Jesus. And as I said last week, we are following his example. Again, let me be clear here. Jesus said, I almost said Paul again. Jesus said to his own disciples, the lords of the kings of the Gentiles lorded over them, or the rulers of the Gentiles lorded over them. Not so with you. If anyone would be great within the kingdom of God, he must become a servant. And then Jesus models that, right? Philippians 2, the cross. Mm-hmm. He models that and calls us to follow his example. If anyone would come after me, if anyone would be my disciple, must follow me, take up his cross and follow me, right? So Paul becomes an example of this ministry. We carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus might be revealed. And then we are called, as I said last week, Gorman, resurrectional cruciformity. We take that and model on ourselves, and that's what it means to live to live functionally a glorified life now, is to rule in the same sense that Jesus was glorified on the cross. So that's what I think right now.
Yeah. So let's take this back to Romans. Well,
Sure.
No, I think this is great. I want to kind of book in this. We started this with Romans 8, 29 and 30. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. Mm-hmm. So through this lens, what's happening here? The
predestination, as we've said before, is the plan, right? It's that God had planned before even the creation of the world, knowing what was going to happen, knowing that humanity was going to abdicate its rule, knew that the Son was going to come and was going to become the true image, created humanity to be the image of God, right? They gave that image up and exchanged that for the glory of, or for the image of snakes and idols and all this kind of thing, serpents, and well, I was saying serpents because of the garden.
Yeah, I know.
To use Paul's language in chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, they took on deception. Right. Jesus in John chapter 8, when you lie, you're speaking your native language, right? He is the father of lies. And instead we speak truth, is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4. We speak the truth plainly. That's the role that we're called to. We've been deceived all this time. Now we're called to speak truth. And so God knew in advance, not individuals, I don't think. I mean, although he knew them, but it doesn't mean that he caused individuals to be ones who came to him. It means that all of those who would be conformed to his purpose, called according to his purpose, which is the verse right before that, verse 28, obviously, those who would be called according to his purpose, that his plan was for them to be again conformed to the image of his Son. Jesus becomes the first fruits, right? The firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So he becomes the true image of the human, the true human image. And then we are called to be conformed to that. And so our glory, our glorification is as much as we are transformed into his image, not that we look like him, not even, and here's the interesting thing is, I didn't really mention this too much, but one of the ways that this is taken is that it has to do with morality, that we take on the moral image of Jesus. And that's not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that's Paul's primary point. His primary point is functionally, we become like him. We begin to become co-heirs with Christ, and we begin to rule alongside of him in this kingdom.
So as we look at the end of 30 here, it says, those he justified, he also glorified. So the justification has happened in Christ, and also the glorification. I think so. Coming back to your primary role. So so would you say like that he glorified goes back to conform to the image of his son?
I think so. Yeah. So we pledge ourselves to be, part of his kingdom and, to rule, even the least in the kingdom will be greater than John the Baptist. Right. So I think that's what we're called to do. We're called to, how do I say this? We extend the kingdom of God in all places, in our own hearts, in our own families and communities. We want his rule to be extended. That's what we're after. So,
yeah. Well, this is great, Brian. I really appreciate it. And I know we talked about splitting hairs to begin with, but it's good for us to kind of. Sometimes we get to hard passages and we just go, they're hard passages, and we move on. And it's not to say that they're an easy passage, but that Paul is trying to communicate something to us.
I think there's something really important
and getting down to it.
I think really central to what it means to be a follower of Jesus that's going on here. So I get that it's a little hard to understand. Again, Richard Hayes, we're seeing these echoes of the Old Testament. We just have not familiarized ourselves enough with the Old Testament that Paul used in order to understand and to see these parallels, this language similarity that he's using, I think, in some of these places. But a lot of these things are coming to light now, which I think is a very helpful and useful thing. So.
Yeah, great. Well, Brian, I really appreciate your work on this and, your studies that, it's just pouring out here in the bistro. I love it. So appreciate it.
Coffee,
well, if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're enjoying the podcast, you can go to thebiblebistro.com. You can find our latest episodes, share. You can listen there. You can also sign up if you want to help us a little bit with the financial burden of the Bible Bistro. You can choose to support us there. You can also support us by sharing episodes that you're liking. Share it with people you know. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts.
Click the like button. I've learned there's this thing called an algorithm, and when you like us.
Yes.
And comment on it. It helps our algorithm. I don't know what that means.
It helps the algorithm. I don't know who's behind the wheel of the algorithm, but we should appreciate your support on the online platform.
Maybe the God of this age. I don't know.
Well, it's probably pretty true there. All right, so do your part in the battle and fight against it. Well, Brian, thanks so much, and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Roles.
That's right.
We'll see
Brian,
you soon.
Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.